Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
My name is George, and my wife's name is Dorothy. We've been married for almost 32 years. I don't know if we'll live to see our 33rd anniversary. I just found out that Dorothy cheated on me, not just once, not even for 6 months, but for 28 years. My life has now been completely turned upside down. Where should I go next? I'm over 50, I've been married for 32 years, and we have 3 grown children. More precisely, 2 of them are already adults with their own families, and we call our youngest, who just turned 18 and started college. Let me step back 32 years and give you some background. Dorothy is originally from Michigan and moved to Ohio to attend college. I, on the other hand, trained to be a welder. We met at a party. Dorothy had just received a breakup letter. I don't know what it's called when a guy gives a woman a breakup letter. She was very depressed because this guy, Paul, whom she thought was the love of her life, had left her. When she started school in Ohio, she was devastated and continued to walk around in a fog until her friend Dixie told her she needed a distraction. They went to a party where I just happened to be. As soon as I saw her, I immediately fell in love with her. She was a small, frail girl, only 5 feet tall, weighing maybe 110 pounds. She had dark brown hair and the cutest dimples you could imagine. They say that I'm quite a cheerful person. I always joke and am the life of the party. I started talking to Dorothy, and within 6 months, we were married. I think I managed to catch her on the rebound. Our life was good. I have nothing to compare it to. Our marriage was quite ordinary. No big surprises, no second or third husbands or wives, just a normal, everyday marriage for the last 32 years. We went on family vacations, went bowling, golfed, and attended our kids' sporting events and performances. We were ordinary parents who loved our children and practically lived for them. Dorothy and I both worked. She's a teacher, and I am a welder. Money was never a big problem, but sometimes it was a little tight. We own our house, and our 2 vehicles, her car and my truck, are paid off. Our nightlife was good when we were younger. We did it 3 to 4 times a week. After George Jr. was born, we were lucky if it happened twice a week. 5 years later, after Mike was born, I was lucky if we could have intimacy even once a week. I understood. She was a working woman with 2 small children, and such a life leaves an imprint. I helped a lot, but Dorothy probably didn't notice. Then, when Dot was born, Mike was already 5 years old. Dot became the love of my life. She could always get her way if she just asked, and she knew it. With children, we always had love and abundance. There was practically nothing we wouldn't do for them. We raised them with love, and they grew up well-mannered, smart, and honest. We couldn't wish for better children. The only thing that has suffered over the years is probably our intimate life. By this point, our intimacy occurred no more than twice a month, if we were lucky. We haven't tried anything new and intimate. Several times, Dorothy told me that night does not play a big role in her life. This is quite a disappointment for a man, so I didn't insist. When I tried, she had an intimate with me, but it was more of a mechanical action with little kissing or hugging. Don't think that I am such a wonderful husband who has never cheated on his wife. I had intimate relations on the side. I often went to bars after work. If a woman flirted with me, I took advantage of it. I liked weird night, especially when there was none at home. I didn't have affairs, but I had a lot of one-off encounters. This went on for 15 years. If I didn't get it at home, I wasn't going to stay without it. Looking back, I realized that our marriage was not based on strong love between us. After the first few years after George Jr. was born, our marriage felt more like a relationship based on respect, without much emotional connection. I don't remember Dorothy ever saying "I love you" to me. I think it was mostly a marriage of convenience, except where the children were concerned. Now, about the present. I was in the garage when the phone rang, and Dorothy and I answered at the same time. It was Dixie, and I decided to listen for a few seconds before making a joke like, "Watch what you're saying, I'm here too." When I heard Dixie ask Dorothy if she was ready to go to the homecoming, I just hung up, thinking she would tell me about it later. When I entered the house, she was still talking to Dixie. After she hung up, I asked what they were talking about, and she said, "We're planning to go to their 35th reunion." I looked at her and said, "You didn't even mention it or ask if I wanted to go with you. George, in 35 years, you've never gone with me. Why should I think you want to go now?" She answered, "They'll call Dixie and tell her you'll take me." "Wait," I replied. "I don't want to go to some stupid old homecoming. I haven't even been to my own. I just thought it would be nice if you told me about it, that's all." Something felt wrong. I didn't know what, and I had no reason not to trust Dorothy. None at all, but still I installed wiretapping on my phone. I used it to record people's comments when I took welding jobs. I always warned them that the conversation would be recorded. This solved a lot of problems if there were disagreements about the work. The recording was activated by voice, and when the conversation ended, the recording stopped. The next day, I listened to the recording. Dorothy called Dixie again and apologized for hanging up so abruptly the day before. She said she was worried that I would suddenly want to go to my high school reunion, and that it would ruin everything after all her preparations. What preparations? With whom? I thought. When she returned home, I said I wanted to talk to her. She looked at me in surprise and asked, "About what?" "Your homecoming. Maybe this year I'll go with you." Who even goes to these meetings? In all these 35 years, you've never gone with me. She looked a little nervous but started talking. "Well, let's think about it. About 30 classmates gather at these meetings. Some come with their spouses, others come alone, and some bring their families to the buffet dinner, then take the kids home and return for the dance. Singles and divorced people bring friends, but you're only allowed to bring one friend. In total, up to 100 people sometimes gather for such events." What a terrible word. Event, I thought. "When will this meeting take place?" I asked. "October 8th. The first Saturday in October," she replied. "Tell me if you decide to go, so I can change my reservation. I'll let you know for sure by the end of next week." Would I know anyone there other than Dixie and her husband Joe? I asked. Dorothy thought for a moment and replied, "I don't think you've ever met any of my classmates, so most likely you don't know anyone. And Paul, your ex-boyfriend, didn't he go to the same school as you?" She got nervous and said, "Yes, he is married. He has a family just like us." "Why are you pestering me with these stupid questions about old meetings and old friends? What came over you? Do you want me to stay home to make you feel safer?" "Sorry, honey, it's just an old guy getting nosy. I'll let you know as soon as I can about the meeting," I replied. I contacted a private detective with whom I had worked before. He had checked the construction sites I was working on to get an idea of what I would be up against, but this time the task was different. "Jane's Investments, how can I help you?" The secretary's voice rang out. "Jim, please," I replied. "Just a minute," she said, then called Jim. "Hi, George, long time no see. What can I do for you?" "Well, Jim, I have a suspicion that my wife is cheating on me. I need a private investigator to check something to put my mind at ease. This must be done as quickly as possible, very quietly, and without suspicion." "Will it do?" I asked. "Give me some facts, and I'll tell you if I can help," Jim replied. "The fact is that I have suspicions my wife is cheating on me. I don't have proof, but I have this feeling. She's going to a high school reunion and doesn't want me to go. She has been going there every 5 years for the past 30 years. I've never gone and didn't suspect anything wrong before. I hope your investigation turns out to be in vain. The meeting takes place in Michigan and almost always in the same place. The location may have changed several times. What do you think, Jim?" I asked again. "Well, George, it's going to cost a fortune to travel, but I can find out everything I need by Friday. This is basically a record check. We need to go back through the dates and see if anything comes up. I hope we can put your mind at ease," Jim replied. "Thanks, Jim. We'll talk on Friday," I said. I gave him all the information that could help in the investigation and went back to work. I had no idea why I was so worried. I lived a completely decent life without serious problems. It was just one of those gut feelings, and I needed to get rid of all the questions I had. Maybe I'm becoming insecure with age. I'm already over 50. I hoped nothing would turn out to be true, but for some reason, I knew it wasn't. Jim called me on Friday. "George, I've gotten a few people involved in this case, and I've come across something that doesn't add up. First, I spoke to the reunion committee and introduced myself as a government official, explaining that I needed to look at their alumni reunion records for the last 30 years. I told them that this was part of a security clearance test and that I could not reveal any information to them. They said that this was strictly classified, and if anyone started spreading rumors, they could be prosecuted. The more you tell people, the more information they provide. This is simply incredible. I showed them the fake IDs, and they gave me all the information for the last 30 years. Here's what I learned. Your wife attended all 6 meetings. Her name appears in the logbooks for all 6 events. The strange thing begins with the fact that at the first 2 meetings, she had a room booked, but for the last 4, her name was not among those booked. We assumed she was living with someone else. There's no way to know exactly who, but from the names you gave me, her friend Dixie and her husband Joe also attended all 6 meetings and booked a room for 2. So, your wife didn't stay with them. The only other name you gave me was Paul Simon. He also attended all 6 meetings. At the first 2 meetings, he booked a room for 1 person, but for the last 4, he was listed as Mr. and Mrs. Paul Simon. We assume his wife was with him at the last 4 reunions, but her name is nowhere listed as a classmate or guest. George, maybe you should find out if your wife was really there. I can't do more without giving myself away, and you didn't want that. Well, that's all I have for now. If you need anything, just call. I'm always in touch. I thanked Jim for his work and began to think about what he had told me. Things weren't going very well. There was no real evidence yet, but my inner voice kept telling me the truth. When I returned home, Dorothy wasn't there yet, so I decided to listen to the recordings from the listening device. Dorothy called Dixie again and said I could still go to the meeting, but she didn't know what to do. Dixie told her, just call Paul. He'll understand. I was stunned. The truth began to emerge. It turned out that Dorothy was going to meet Paul. Her friend Dixie might have been aware of it, or even involved. Then, the first of 2 bombs dropped. Dorothy began to cry and said, "This is my special time with Paul. I don't want to lose him. I love him so much, and always have." Dixie replied, "Calm down, Dorothy. You're losing yourself. My God, girl, you gave birth to children from him. What more do you want?" Dorothy replied, "I know. I'm just upset. Forgive me. I'll call you later." Then she hung up. What did she just say? I played the recording over and over again. Dorothy never denied it. On tape, she admitted it. Were my children not mine? I raised them for 32 years, and now I find out they might not be mine? No, this can't be true. Maybe I misunderstood the message. No, this couldn't be happening. How could I not have noticed this after 32 years? I couldn't face her now. I was furious. I left her a note saying that I needed to go to work in another city and would return tomorrow. I also told her that I had important work to do on the day of her homecoming and that I wouldn't be able to go. My life had completely fallen apart. I needed proof about the children. It was too much for me. I remembered that when the kids were younger, Dorothy had taken them to the state fair, where there was a special DNA laboratory for children. DNA analysis could be done for a small fee. I remember that the authorities actively promoted this program for identification purposes. Dorothy had done DNA testing for our children. I remembered coming home screaming, "Daddy, Daddy, guess what? George and Mike are my brothers. They took our blood, and we are all related." Dorothy then told me that it was a school and state DNA identification program. I remember looking at Dot and starting to laugh, saying, "That's good, honey, for all of us." But now, I was no longer so sure. I remembered that the test results were kept in a safe. I needed to get copies. When I got home, I decided to make an appointment with a doctor to check a few things. I went to one of those urgent care clinics, and they saw me right away. I told the doctor that I needed a DNA test to see if I should have a vasectomy. I didn't want to do it if it wasn't necessary. I also asked if they could do a DNA test while I was there. I didn't actually intend to have a vasectomy. I just came up with that as a way to check the numbers. The doctor took the necessary samples, but said the results would only be ready in a week. I replied that this was normal and that I would use protections for now. We both laughed. I went through the next week as if on autopilot, expecting the results, but I already knew the truth. I decided to start planning my revenge. I had a month to prepare everything. Our 33rd wedding anniversary was 2 days after the high school reunion. I decided to arrange a surprise for everyone. A lot of people would get hurt, but at least the truth would come out. I remembered that Dorothy had said that the buffet was a great place to bring your family, so I decided to invite all 3 of our children to this surprise. First, I called George Jr., our eldest son, who is 29 and has 3 children. I told him about the high school reunion his mom was going to, and told him I had told her I couldn't go, but I thought I'd surprise her for our anniversary. I invited him and his family to come with their children and grandchildren. She would never have expected this from me. I was willing to pay for him and his family's accommodation for one night. I thought we didn't have to go until Saturday evening and could spend Sunday together as a family. He was excited about the idea of throwing a surprise for his mom. He said he would discuss it with his wife and contact me, but he didn't see it as a problem. Next, I called Mike, who is 24, recently married, and has a 6-month-old baby. I told him the same story, and he also said that he would discuss it with his wife, but didn't see a problem with it. Finally, I called my youngest daughter, who is now 18. She just started college in Michigan a month ago. I told her the same story I told the boys, and she was delighted. She said, "Mom will be so happy. I can't wait. I don't need to make a reservation, Dad. My dorm is only 5 miles from the Radisson. I can spend the evening with you, then go back to the dorm and return the next day. It's not worth spending money on a room." I told all 3 of them not to hint or mention anything to their mother under any circumstances, or our plan would fail. God, what wonderful children I have. But why aren't they mine? I think after the meeting, I will find out if they want to remain my children. Once I had calmed down a bit, I was able to meet Dorothy. It was then that I began to look at our life differently. I realized that there was really no love. It was simply a marriage of convenience. She lived her life, and I lived mine. It wasn't difficult for me to behave as usual. In fact, I began to act like a loving husband. I wanted to make her think that things were fine. I told her to dress up, and I'd take her to dinner. I complimented her, and she really did look good. We had a wonderful dinner, and I was as nice as possible to her. I even opened the car door for her. She looked at me and asked, "George, what's gotten into you?" I simply told her that I wanted to be a loving husband and that I wanted the rest of my years to be good. I don't think she believed me, but she didn't ask any questions. I made sure she had enough wine, hoping that if she was drunk enough, I could get intimate with her. When we got home, she was a little tipsy. I helped her undress and decided to try to please her. We hadn't done this in years, and then I took her and gave it my all. I poured everything I could into her. I continued to wonder who she might be fantasizing about when she started to get aroused. Damn, this is really good, I thought. We'll have to do this a couple more times before she meets Paul. Over the next few days, there were no new recordings on the telephone wiretap. In fact, she didn't say anything to Dixie about our wild night, and that actually disappointed me a little. She probably didn't want Dixie to know that she had cheated on Paul by sleeping with her husband. I suggested to Dorothy that we go somewhere else on Saturday night. Why not invite Dixie and Joe? We could all have dinner together and maybe even dance a little. This way, you can practice dancing before your graduation. The next day, I heard a new message on the device. She was talking to Dixie again. "Hi, Dixie," Dorothy said. "I called to tell you that George is acting strange." "What kind of strange things?" Dixie asked. "Well, he started acting very affectionate, saying nice things, treating me like gold. This doesn't look like him at all. Do you think he suspects something? Are you kidding me?" Dixie said, "You've been cheating on your husband for 32 years. You have 3 children from your ex-lover, and you think he suspects something and will now treat you like gold? For this?" "You're probably right," Dorothy replied. "This doesn't sound like revenge, does it? Anyway, George wanted me to ask if you and Joe would like to come with us to dinner and dancing on Saturday." "Sounds good," said Dixie, "but it doesn't sound like George at all. Maybe he finally feels guilty for all the times he cheated on you. It's a little late for repentance, isn't it? Have you already written him a divorce letter?" "I started it, but I don't want to give it to him until I leave for the meeting." "Do you think you can hold off Joe for the evening?" "I wouldn't want him to let it slip. He's Paul's best friend, after all." "Joe will be fine," Dixie replied. "He'll be glad when this story of betrayal finally ends. Hell, maybe you can sleep with your husband one last time. I won't tell Paul." She laughed. This completely confirmed my suspicions. Now I knew everything. All I had to do was wait for the test results, and then everything would become completely clear. It was time for Saturday night, and Dorothy and I got dressed up for our double date with her friends, Dixie and Joe. I called a taxi, figuring we'd all be too drunk to drive after the evening. Maybe even rent a room if necessary. We picked up Dixie and Joe, and they were surprised to see a taxi. I just told them that this way we could drink as much as we wanted without having to worry about getting home. Joe looked at me and said, "I've never seen you like this." "George, I just thought we should live a little before it's too late," I replied. "Actually, this evening is entirely at my expense." I got a bonus for the job I took on Dorothy's homecoming day. I couldn't refuse, and since I can't go to the meeting, we'll have some fun today. Everyone was a little surprised, but Dorothy didn't say anything. I think she decided that since we were getting divorced soon, there was no point in objecting. I glanced at Joe and said, "Damn, what beautiful ladies we have today." They both wore similar dresses that accentuated their figures, mid-thigh length, and their legs looked great. Of course, they smiled at my comment. From that moment, my life went into revenge mode. I had no more regrets other than the fact that the children were not mine, but it was like I had invited two women to the evening. I was just going to enjoy the moment. We stopped at a great restaurant and bar at the Holiday Inn. We ordered drinks before dinner. Everyone wanted cocktails, and I, as usual, took a beer. After the first round, I wanted to get the next drink myself and ordered doubles for everyone. I wanted these three to be drunk by the end of the evening. I only drank beer, and being an experienced beer drinker, I knew how much I could handle. As we ate, I noticed that everyone started to relax. We began laughing and chatting, enjoying each other's company. The mood lightened, and everyone seemed to have let go of their worries, embracing the evening. After dinner, we went to a bar where there was music and a lively atmosphere, and we danced. I wanted to grab some more drinks, and the girls were having fun, laughing at almost everything. Dorothy jokingly asked me, "Are you trying to get me drunk?" I smiled and said something playful in return, and we all laughed together. I asked Dorothy to dance, and she agreed, standing up. Joe and Dixie joined us as well. We danced a few slow songs, and then Dorothy said she was feeling a little dizzy, so she sat down while still enjoying her drink. Joe and Dixie returned to the table not long after, and I asked Joe if it would be all right if I danced with Dixie. He laughed and said, "Of course. I can't keep up with her." Dixie and I moved to the dance floor, stepping away from the table a little so we could talk. She was starting to feel the effects of the drinks, so I just held her close as we swayed to the music. She mentioned she had never seen me quite like this, and I asked her what she meant. She smiled and said, "I like this. It's fun." After a couple of dances, we all returned to the table, continuing to chat and share funny stories. As the night wore on, the girls were starting to feel the effects of the drinks, and Joe was also getting pretty tired but still able to walk. I suggested we head to the room ID booked, which had two large beds, for some rest. No one objected. Everyone was in need of a break. On the way up, the girls mentioned they didn't have any night clothes, so I reassured them that it was fine, since we were all friends. They decided to freshen up, and while Joe and I waited outside, we continued chatting about the fun of the evening. I waited in the hallway while Joe and I discussed the evening. He said he had a great time, thanked me, and mentioned that, in his opinion, I turned out to be a good guy. It was clear he was uneasy about the upcoming divorce. I reassured him it wasn't a problem, but added that the night wasn't over yet. We entered the room, and the girls were already lying in bed, dressed in comfortable clothing. They seemed extremely tired. The only light in the room came from the bathroom, and the space was quite dim. I took off my outer clothes, leaving just my underwear, and Joe did the same. I sat on the edge of my bed and gently pulled the blanket off Dorothy, who was lying on her back, fast asleep. Joe just looked at us, bewildered. I asked him if he had ever seen Dorothy in that state, and being a bit drunk, he simply shook his head. I told him that now he had the chance to see her. He moved closer and sat on the edge of the bed next to Dorothy. I suggested he take a closer look, saying it might be a rare opportunity. Seeing his wife asleep, he seemed to relax and started to observe Dorothy more closely. I carefully removed her panties. A drunk man simply could not miss such a spectacle. He couldn't resist, and his hand reached down to explore her. I looked at him and asked, "Have you ever wanted to have an intimate with her?" Joe, still focused on what was happening, replied a lot of times, but she was Dixie's friend. I told him he could do it right now, that this was his only chance. He didn't need to be told twice. He stood up, pulled down his boxers, and positioned himself between Dorothy's legs. While he was doing this, I went to Dixie's bed, carefully removed the blanket from her, and began to unclasp her bra. Joe noticed this and wanted to say something, but didn't dare, as he was busy having a night with my wife. I continued to remove Dixie's underwear and eventually ended up between her legs. Joe, noticing that I was now having an intimate with his wife, seemed to gain some courage and began moving more vigorously. He was so engrossed in his act that he probably didn't even realize what was really happening. When I finished with Dixie, she opened her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, George, that was wonderful." I grinned and replied, "You're welcome, Dixie. If you want to repeat it, it'll soon be lonely." Her eyes widened, and there was a look of understanding, as if she realized I knew about the divorce she had been discussing with Dorothy. I smiled at her, then stood up and covered her with a blanket. At that moment, Joe finished with Dorothy and lay down next to her without saying a word. I lay down next to Dorothy and fell into a deep sleep. In the morning, I woke up first, probably because I had only drunk beer the night before. I took a shower and went down to the restaurant to have a cup of coffee. About half an hour later, I called the room, and Dorothy answered. "Good morning, dear. How is everyone doing?" I asked. "Where are you, George?" Dorothy replied. "Calm down, Dorothy. I'm just in the restaurant drinking coffee. You were all fast asleep, and I didn't want to wake anyone up, so I took a shower and left. Do you want me to get you some coffee, or would you prefer to come down here?" I asked. "We'll be down in a few minutes," she replied. I would give a lot to be a fly on the wall when they all woke up. Joe had seen me having a night with his wife, but he couldn't say anything because he was having an intimate with mine. Dixie knew that I knew about the divorce, but she couldn't tell Dorothy because I was having a night with her. When I told her, God, how I love it when everything goes according to plan, they all went downstairs to the restaurant, and we ordered breakfast. It was noticeable that everyone was slightly tense, of course, except for me. The week passed quietly as I listened to the conversations between Dorothy and Dixie. They talked a little about our double date. Dorothy admitted that I had probably undressed her. I then heard her say that she noticed her underwear was missing the next morning. She asked if Joe had had an intim with Dixie. Dixie responded that she was a complete mess too, and Joe probably also did his thing while she was unconscious. Now, in front of me, two friends were lying to each other. Dixie also asked if Dorothy had finished her divorce letter. Dorothy replied that she had finished it and hidden it in her underwear drawer. She planned to leave it on the table Thursday night when she left for her high school reunion. When Dorothy left for work, I looked in her underwear drawer and found my goodbye letter. Here is what it said. Dorothy to George. Dear George, you better grab yourself a beer and sit down before reading this letter. I'm leaving you. I'll file for divorce when I get back from my high school reunion. I know this will be a complete shock to you after 32 years of our marriage, but I at least owe you an explanation. When we got married, I was on an emotional high after my affair with Paul Simon. You knew about him, but you had never met him. Believe it or not, you and he look a lot alike. You both have brown hair, brown eyes, are about 6 feet tall, and weigh about 200 pounds. At least you did 32 years ago. That's probably why I was drawn to you, but no matter how hard I tried, it was always Paul, not you. Every time we had a night, I imagined him, not you. Then, what was supposed to happen happened. I went to a high school reunion 5 years after high school and met Paul again. I called him, and he was thrilled about it, but so were you. I didn't know what to do. Paul and I decided that we would keep our marriages, but would see each other at homecomings and reminisce about old times. However, we met several times when I went to Michigan to visit my parents before they died. 5 years later, it happened again. We met, spent time together, and swore to keep our lives a secret. It was like a fantasy. There was even a movie about old lovers who meet every year to renew their love. That's what happened between Paul and me. Of course, when I returned home after the second meeting, we had an intim again. It was one of the best times I had having intimate with you, especially after dating. Maybe it was cheating, but the night after those meetings was amazing. 9 months later, Michael was born. See where I'm going with this? Michael was also Paul's son. I know I should feel guilty, but I don't. You were a good father to the boys. You did everything a good father should do. Paul was delighted again, knowing how prolific he was. He now had 2 children with his wife and 2 with me. On the third meeting, after all the passionate love between Paul and me, we decided we needed to tell someone. We wanted to share our joy with each other, so I told Dixie and Joe. They were stunned at first, but then said they always suspected something was going on all these years. They noticed that Paul and I always seemed so happy together. Paul was Joe's best friend, after all. After Dot was born, I mentioned to Paul that I had had a vasectomy. He had 2 children with his wife, and now 3 with me. I told him I didn't want any more children. Of course, as was customary, when I returned home after the 3rd meeting, we had a night again. Damn it. As you know, I took DNA tests at the state fair, and all 3 children came from the same father. You truly were a wonderful father. I'm not going to tell the kids that Paul is their biological father. They love you too much and will most likely hate me. I know you cheated on me too, for years. We got weird calls from women looking for you, and there were all those late-night trips to the bar. I can't blame you because I didn't give you what you needed as often. I know you have questions, but we won't talk much. I will try to explain why we stayed together. Paul and I started out as a fleeting romance, an affair, but we discovered that our true feelings were for each other. We wanted to be together, so we finally decided to wait until our kids were grown up and then move somewhere together to spend the remaining years of our lives. Todd is now in college, and George Jr. and Mike already have their own families. I know that you won't have any problems living your life because there wasn't much love between us to begin with. Paul told his wife he wanted a divorce last year, and it has already been finalized. It's just you and me, George. We've both contributed to our assets, and my lawyer says an uncontested divorce can be dissolved in 6 months with an equal 50-50 split. Just keep in mind that Paul and I met up whenever we could, even though the 200-mile distance made it difficult. This happened more than once every 5 years. We thought about this a lot. Sorry for misleading you for so long. There's nothing more to say, George. Good luck to you in the future. Best regards, Dorothy. It's time to go back to the doctor and get the results I needed for the divorce proceedings. I walked into the doctor's office and waited for my name to be called. George Manning, the receptionist said. I got up. Please follow me, she said. I entered the office, and soon the doctor came in. Good afternoon, George, said the doctor. How are you today? I just came for the results of the DNA test, I replied. Well, George, you won't need a vasectomy, the doctor said. That motorcycle accident you had 15 years ago severely damaged your lower pelvic region. You will no longer be able to become a father. I don't know if this is good or bad, but you won't need a vasectomy. What about my DNA, doctor? Do you have my results? I asked. The doctor handed me a graph with lots of dots and lines on it. I looked at him but honestly said, I don't know what I'm looking at. The doctor replied, you need to see another graph to explain it better. He reached into the file and pulled out another DNA test, which I had taken from the safe. The doctor placed both graphs on the light panel and began to study them. This chart is for a girl, he said. Do you see where all these dots and lines intersect? This means there is a 99% chance that this girl is your daughter. I couldn't hold back my tears. Joy and pride overwhelmed me. My daughter, my flesh and blood. The doctor looked at me and asked, is everything okay? George? Everything is fine, doctor, I replied. Can you look at these other 2 graphs? I asked. Let's see, he said. They are both boys and probably brothers. Now, let's put your chart next to them. The doctor looked at the graphs and continued. Yes, you see, the points and lines on all these graphs are the same. There is a 99% chance that these are your sons, the doctor concluded. I can put all this in writing and notarize it if you want. I nodded. Please do. That would be great. Then I asked another question. Doctor, what does 99% probability mean? The doctor laughed. That means there is only 1 chance in 9 million that these children are not yours. Only 1 person in 9 million could be their father, so those are pretty safe odds. I left the doctor's office a very happy person. After receiving the documents with the DNA results and the notarized letter, I headed home. Monday arrived, and I only had a few days until Thursday to prepare a plan. I started by looking for a good lawyer. My friend mentioned Sally Hawk, who had helped him and his friend through their divorce. I made an appointment with Sally, taking with me all the DNA documents and a copy of Dorothy's letter. Damn, Sally was a beauty, but I immediately realized she was a no-nonsense person. She read Dorothy's letter first, and I noticed her eyes water a little. Then she looked at the DNA results and almost laughed out loud. Well, Mr. Manning, what do you suggest? She asked. First of all, please call me George, if that's convenient for you, I replied. And secondly, I want to get everything I can legally. Sally began to explain, you've had a 32-year marriage, good or bad. Your wife accuses you of adultery, but doesn't provide any evidence. On the other hand, you have this letter written in her hand where she admits to cheating for 32 years. If you file for divorce first, you can receive 65% of all assets. There will, of course, be some minor disputes, but the Ohio courts will be on your side. You could get even more if the children weren't yours, but I think what you have is much more important than money. I looked at her and nodded with a smile. Sally continued, I will need a list of all credit accounts, savings accounts, and a rough list of assets. We will immediately freeze all credit cards registered in your name. I'm also going to freeze all savings accounts pending litigation. We will allow withdrawals of up to $100 per day, with a maximum of $1,500 per week, until all paperwork is completed. It will take about a week. I think your wife's retirement account should go to her, and yours should go to you. Each of you earned that money. Also, any family heirlooms that are passed down must be returned to their rightful owner. Are you planning to stay in your current home? If not, I suggest holding an auction and selling the house and its contents, splitting the money in the ratio of 65% to 35%. That would be the easiest thing, she said confidently. Sally looked at me and asked, I know this is hard for you, but life goes on. I've seen this hundreds of times. Now it all comes down to money. Do you have anything to say? I nodded and replied, just thanks for your help and advice. I agree with everything you suggested. I don't want to live in this big house alone. Too many memories, both good and bad. Is it possible that the divorce papers will be delivered at the reunion this Saturday, along with a draft of the proposed agreement? I would also like to get a restraining order to prevent her from entering the house without my permission and taking any property. Sally replied, it will cost a little more, but we can speed up the process. I'll have the deputy deliver the documents to the reunion on Saturday. The injunction will take effect on Sunday. You must understand that she still has the right to enter the house, but she won't be able to take anything other than her personal belongings. We discussed everything, and I thanked Sally again. I started planning the last 2 days before my wife left for her meeting and disappeared from my life. I contacted my sons and daughter to make sure they were attending their high school reunion. Everyone agreed to be there. I then told them that I wanted to meet them before dinner. I had something very important to tell them, something that could change their minds about whether to go to dinner. But most of all, I needed their support. This was a dramatic life change for me and their mother. I told them I couldn't give them more details now, but I'd see them on Saturday at the Rada Hotel. I didn't like keeping them in the dark, but I really wanted them to be there. I mentioned to Dorothy that since she was taking Thursday and Friday off to leave early for the reunion, we could go out to dinner on Wednesday night. She thought it was a good idea. I knew she just wanted to act normal and not make any waves at this stage of the game. It's Wednesday, and we went to dinner. I acted like it was a date. I opened doors for her, pushed back her chair, and complimented her. She drank wine, trying not to get drunk, and I drank my regular beer. After dinner, we went to the cinema to watch a romantic film, then headed home. She said she had a great evening and liked everything. When we returned home, she changed into a nightgown and went to bed. I completely undressed and lay down next to her. She looked at me and said, "Not today, George. I'm very tired." I had never been rude to Dorothy, but tonight was going to be different. She was leaving me, so I had nothing to lose. She screamed, "George, stop it." I said, "No," but I kept squeezing. She tried to push my hand away with both hands, but she wasn't strong enough. She screamed again, "George, stop it. I'm not in the mood." "Well, I'm in the mood. We could do this the good way or the bad way." "Your choice," I replied. She looked at me, terrified, and said, "George, what's gotten into you? Please don't hurt me. I don't intend to hurt you, Dorothy, but I do intend to have a night with you, and do it well." I asked again, "Good or bad?" She hesitated for a moment and then gave in. "Okay, George, I'll play along." She sat up to take off her nightgown, leaving only her panties on. "Now lie back down," I said. As she lay back, I gently touched her waist, pulling her closer. Her breathing became ragged as I softly stroked her thigh. We were close, and her touch responded to mine, creating a subtle tension. I caressed her, feeling how she gradually surrendered to the moment. She whispered softly, "It feels so good. Please don't stop." Her words enveloped me in warmth, and I continued kissing her skin tenderly, feeling her body respond to every touch. Our movements were smooth and harmonious, as if we understood each other without words. I looked at her, and her eyes shone with desire and tenderness. We paused for a moment, and I asked, "Do you want to continue?" She nodded, her breathing deepening. Our bodies synchronized, and we lost ourselves in the moment, taking our time and enjoying every second. When it was all over, we lay next to each other, tired but happy. She smiled and said quietly, "It was incredible." She fell exhausted onto the bed and immediately fell asleep. I got up, took a quick shower, and thought about recent events. It was a shame she had been such an unfaithful wife. The last few weeks had been the best intimate of my life. On Thursday morning, I woke up and started getting ready for work. I looked at Dorothy. She was still lying without anything in the same position as yesterday. I felt a little sad, knowing this was the last time I'd see her like this. Although we didn't have much love in our marriage, we did have good times. I knew that when I returned home in the evening, a letter from her asking for a divorce would be waiting for me. I took my things and went to work. I needed to stop by home to pick up a few tools. Her car was gone, and I was glad about that. I didn't want to run into her right now. When I entered the house, I didn't see any letter. I decided to check my answering machine to see if there were any new messages. I heard a call from Dixie, asking if Dorothy was ready to go. They were supposed to pick her up around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The trip would take less than 4 hours. I looked at my watch. It was already noon. Then I heard Dorothy's voice. "Dixie, am I sure I'm making the right decision? I'm starting to have doubts." "What do you mean? You waited 32 years to be with Paul. What happened?" Dixie asked. "George seems to have changed in the last few weeks. I still have feelings for him, although it's not love," Dorothy replied. "You slept with him again, right?" Dixie reproached her. "It was your intimate that caused everything with Paul. I told you not to have a night with George before you left him. I knew it would complicate things. Why don't you call Paul? This might help you figure it out," Dixie suggested. "You're right, Dixie. As soon as I'm back from the reunion with Paul, everything will fall into place," Dorothy replied. "I'll go to the phone booth and call Paul to calm down. I don't want to call from here so as not to leave traces of the call." Apparently, she is now on the street calling her lover. Well, I'll meet him on Saturday with my surprises. I left her a note in which I wrote that it was a pity I didn't find her at home and suggested we have lunch together before she went to the meeting. I even signed it Love, George, to give it a little extra sting. None of this was true, but she didn't know that. When I returned home from work that evening, her letter was waiting for me on the table. Apparently, the conversation with Paul had convinced her to go. I opened the letter, and the only thing that had changed was the handwritten note at the bottom. I will never forget the last 2 weeks. Love, Dorothy. On Saturday, I went to the Rada Hotel. I booked a room for myself, as well as rooms for my sons and their families. I also notified the reunion committee that we were coming to surprise Dorothy for our 33rd anniversary, but I asked that they not tell her about it. I wanted to make sure we had dinner reservations. We all gathered in my room so I could explain the bad news to them. I started by saying, "I had hoped to have a surprise for your mother and me for our anniversary, but circumstances have changed. Your mother is in love with another man and has been with him all these years. She waited until you were all grown up to leave me." Everyone was stunned and said things like, "No, Dad, this can't be true. Are you sure?" "I'm so sorry, Dad. I can't believe Mom did this to you," and many other expressions of shock. Finally, I said, "Stop." She left me this letter before she left for the meeting. She didn't want you to see it, but I have to show it to you. And then I have another document for you. They all read the letter, and tears welled up in their eyes, especially when they got to the part that said I wasn't their father. When they finished reading, they looked at me and said, "You will always be my father, always," and then hugged me. I smiled and said, "I have good news for all of you. At least I hope you'll perceive it as good." I handed them a letter with the DNA results confirming that I was their biological father. Everyone started crying and hugging me, saying I knew it was true. I just knew it. I looked at my children and their spouses and said, "Although you may be hurt by what your mother did, please understand that she loved you. She didn't love me. You can hate what she did, but don't hate her. She was a wonderful mother to each of you. And like me, she lived just for you. She put her life on hold so that you could have both a mother and a father. Don't blame her for this. Everyone looked sad, but reflected on my words. We all headed to the restaurant, my two sons with their wives and children, and holding my arm. There were at least 100 people in the room when we entered. I told the doorman my name and how many people were in our party. We were shown to a table with a reserved sign. We all sat down, and noticed that I had one extra seat. I said, "I'm expecting a guest." We all looked around and noticed Dot and Joe sitting opposite us. There were Dorothy and Paul. They all seemed to be having a great time. Then Dixie suddenly noticed us and exclaimed loudly, "Oh my God, your family is here." Dorothy's jaw dropped in complete shock. "Oh my God, what are they doing here?" We heard her say. Dot stood up, walked over to her mother's table, looked at her, and said, "I hate what you did to Dad, but I will try to understand because I love you. You are my mother. Dad is here to give a speech. You will still hear it, but the results will be completely different." With that, she returned to our table and sat down. She looked at me and said, "Sorry, Dad, but I had to say it." I simply smiled at her and greeted our guest who had just arrived. "George, Mike, let me introduce you to June Simon, Paul's ex-wife." Everyone greeted her, and her sons introduced their wives and children. June turned out to be a nice woman. She was probably about 55 years old and weighed around 145 pounds. She was dressed very elegantly. When Paul noticed her at our table, he stood up to approach us, but Dorothy stopped him. She knew it would be a big mistake on his part. A podium was set up on the stage for speeches. The presenter stood up and began to speak the usual words before announcing the names of all the graduates present, asking them to stand. When Dixie's name was called, we clapped lightly. Then they called Joe's name, and we clapped again. When they named Dorothy, we made a lot of noise to get attention. We saw that she was ashamed. When Paul's name was announced, we didn't clap at all. Then they called June's name, and we cheered loudly, which made her laugh. After a few speeches, the host invited me, George Manning, onto the stage for a special appearance. Everyone at our table clapped and cheered as I walked to the podium. I began my speech by thanking the committee for giving me the opportunity to speak. I asked to speak to congratulate my wife, Dorothy, I said, pointing to her, on our 33rd wedding anniversary, which would be in 2 days. The audience applauded us. I raised my hands to calm everyone down and continued. Before I left today, Dorothy left me a farewell letter, and I want to read excerpts from it to you. She was in love with Paul Simon throughout our years of marriage. I assume many of you already knew about this. I looked around the room and then said, "Today, she's leaving me for him, so I am serving you, Dorothy, with the divorce papers. Please let the officer in." I asked the sheriff's deputy to walk over and hand Dorothy the divorce papers. He then handed Paul the papers for adultery. "My lawyer has also drafted a divorce agreement, which you can read later," I added. "And one last thing," I continued. In her letter, Dorothy states that Paul is the biological father of my 3 children. I looked at Paul, who was grinning stupidly, and said, "This is not true." I stated firmly. Dot stood up and walked over to her mother, handing her copies of the DNA results for the children and me, as well as a notarized copy from the doctor confirming that I was their biological father. Paul's expression shifted from a grin to an angry frown, and Dorothy burst into tears. Then June stood up and said, "Paul, I only have one thing I want to tell you. While you cheated on me, I also took revenge. Our 2 children are not yours. Their father is your brother John." She handed him the DNA test results. "Your brother John and I are getting married next month." With these words, June and I left the reception. The children wanted to stay and talk to their mother, and I was glad about that. She really was a good mother to them. The next morning, we all met for breakfast before heading home. The children seemed more relaxed. They said that after I left, their mother came to their table to talk to them privately. They didn't tell me what they talked about, but they said they had invited Dorothy to breakfast, but without Paul. I turned around and saw Dorothy there. "Dad, can Mom join us for breakfast?" they asked. I replied, "She will always be a welcome guest at our family events, as long as she doesn't bring Paul with her." Dorothy sat with us and ate. She looked at me with sadness in her eyes and asked, "George, how long have you known all this?" I looked at her and said, "Does it matter?" I stood up, hugged everyone in the family goodbye, and looked at Dorothy, who was crying. I said, "You made your choice. Now you have to live with it." After that, I went home. There are no easy answers to issues like infidelity, adultery, and divorce. Life goes on, and we need to live it day by day. I know that many readers may think that I should have been tougher on Dorothy, but I think everyone resolves such issues in their own way. I'm happy with how I did it. Dorothy says, after George's speech at the homecoming, I felt completely humiliated. The worst part was that I deserved it. Paul, the so-called love of my life, was no protection for me. My friends, Dixie and Joe, just sat there stunned by what was happening. I sat at the same table with them, but essentially I was alone. I made the biggest mistake of my life. I lost my husband by choice, became estranged from my children, whom I truly loved, and may have lost the opportunity to be a part of my grandchildren's lives. After George and June left the reception, I walked over to my children. I listened to them tell me how much I had ruined everything. They reprimanded me thoroughly. We also remembered all the good times we had experienced with and without George. They reminded me that family is the most important thing. Even if it's broken, they still wanted me to be a part of their lives, but couldn't imagine how that would be possible if I moved to another state. They wanted their children to know their grandmother, and it brought tears to my eyes. I told them all how much I love them and always have, without doubting anything. Looking back, I was glad that George was their biological father. He was a good father to them, and he will make an amazing grandfather. I told them that I needed to think a lot and seriously. I'll be home on Monday, but now I don't know where I'll stop. I plan to move in with Paul only after the end of the school term, which was a few months away. There was no doubt that George would not allow me to stay in the house. I guess I should have thought about this earlier. George Jr. asked me to come and stay with him and his family until I decided what to do. They had a spare room in the basement where I could retire. I just started crying because of all the crap I put my family through, and they still loved me. George Jr. looked at me and said, "We don't like what you did, Mom, or the way you did it. But as Dad pointed out, you are our mother, and you always put us first. We need to learn to live with it. We all love you, but not your actions." I looked at George Jr. and said, "Your father said that after what I did to him," and I started crying again. God, what have I done with my life? I kissed all my children and told them how much I loved them and how much I wanted to see them before they went home. They said they were going to have breakfast with their dad in the morning and that I could join them, but they said, "Please, Mom, don't bring your boyfriend." I told them I'd see if I could do it. I then returned to the table with Dixie, Joe, and Paul. I asked Paul if we could leave the meeting. It was enough for me for one evening. Dixie and Joe decided to leave too. The crowd was looking at us too much. I knew we were the topic of everyone's conversation. Paul and I went up to the room. As soon as we arrived, Paul wanted to make love. In fact, all he wanted was intim. I pulled away, telling him that what I needed now was love and compassion. I needed to be held. I needed to be comforted, not have night. I looked at Paul and asked him why he didn't come up to my kids and introduce himself. He said that he was very embarrassed when he found out that they were not his. I looked at him and said, "You always told me that you wanted to be part of the family, that we were going to do everything we could to become one family. Do you still think that way, Paul?" He looked at me and said, "I don't know. I like being with you, but I want you, not your children. I have no connection with them. I thought we would move away from all this and be together." "Paul, what about our families? I want to see my children and grandchildren. I want to be a part of their lives. I know we never talk much about family, but I love mine and want a relationship with them." Paul's answer shocked me. He said, "Dorothy, why don't we just make love tonight and talk about it all tomorrow?" I told him I didn't think so, and that I needed to go out and collect my thoughts. I opened the door and went out. I had nowhere to go, so I went back to the living room and sat in a booth to think. I ordered a drink when two of my former classmates, Barb and Sue, asked if they could join me. I just said, "Of course, I'd enjoy your company." Both Barb and Sue were divorced. They were a little wild, but over the years, they had become very domesticated. I think after you turn 50, your thoughts start to change. We were good friends during our school days, but that was many years ago. We never really talked after I moved to Ohio. They both looked at me and said, "Dorothy, we need to talk to you. It's about Paul Floor." "What about Paul?" I asked. They then started telling me that they didn't want to interfere in my personal life, but after my husband's speech, they realized there was something I needed to know. Paul had dated both of them over the years. He told them he was in an unhappy marriage and was going to get a divorce eventually. They both knew that all Paul wanted was good intimate. Sorry for the language, but we were both divorced, so that was all we needed. Barb said, "We knew you slept with Paul at parties, but we thought you just left after some strange event at the party. We had no idea you were in love with Paul. Otherwise, we would have talked to you years ago. We liked you. We always have. But if you marry Paul, it won't last long." He had intimate relations with most of the divorced women in our class, as well as some married ones. Barb continued, "I have no idea what kind of man your husband is, but your family is what every woman wants when she reaches our age, children, grandchildren. This is the essence of life. Do what you want with Paul, but not for his sake. I won't lose touch with such a wonderful family like yours. Paul didn't get divorced to marry you. His wife, June, finally caught him cheating on film and got the evidence she needed to get a divorce. She left Paul with almost nothing. You'll support him if you two get together." My mind was wandering in a dozen different directions. I didn't know what to think, but for some reason, one question came to mind. I looked at Barb and Sue, thanked them for telling me all this before I made an even bigger fool of myself, and asked them, "Can you answer one question for me? And please be honest. This is very important." They said, "Of course. We will tell you the truth. We have no reason to lie to you. What do you need to know?" "Dorothy, is this one of the married women Paul slept with?" I asked. "Dixie," they said. "Yeah, but we thought you knew since you two were best friends. In fact, there are rumors that you and Paul switched places with Dixie and Joe." "What? No, that's not true. I never had a night with Joe, who started such false, hateful rumors about me." I asked. "Well, Dorothy, you better take a long sip of this drink before I tell you." "You'll need it," Sue replied. Barb continued, "We were sitting around the table at a meeting with Bob and Harry when Bob looked at you and said if I knew she played these games too, I'd try to get into her pants. And Harry said, I was talking to Joe, and he said he was in her pants just a couple of weeks ago." Sue added, then Barb replied, "Nonsense. Dorothy wouldn't sleep with Joe. But Harry said, Joe said he could prove it. Dorothy has a small brown mole on the right side." Barb grinned, but her gaze remained serious. I panicked and started crying. Barb and Sue tried to console me. They said, "We know Joe is lying. Everything will be all right." I looked at them both and said, "But I do have a mole. How could Joe know this?" I asked if I could spend the night with them. I didn't want to go back to Paul that night, and certainly not to Dixie and Joe until I got answers. Sue went to Paul's room to pick up my things. She said Paul was angry, but still gave her my things. I called my son Mike in his room and asked if I could go home with him the next day. He simply said, "Of course, Mom. We'll be glad to take you with us." And then he added, "I love you, Mom." I replied, "And I love you, Mikey." Barb, Sue, and I went back to their room where we talked some more. I was exhausted after everything that had happened that evening. The girls left me in one of the beds, and after drinking one or two more drinks, I quickly fell asleep. The next morning, I went to a family breakfast. It was nice just being around my family. I could see that George wanted to make some snarky remarks about me, but he held back because all the kids were with us. Damn it, I lived 32 years with this man and never really got to know him. He met me when George said goodbye to us before going home. He wished me luck in my new life. I couldn't hold back my tears. Even though I never loved him, we had lived together for 33 years, and tomorrow would have been our anniversary. After breakfast, I returned to Barb and Sue's room to pack my things and head home. I thanked them for letting me spend the night with them and for telling me the truth about Paul. This would help me make important decisions in the future. Then I went to Paul's room. When he opened the door, he was still in his underwear. He was clearly unhappy. Paul said he came to the meeting to spend time with me, and I ruined everything. He didn't mention anything that had happened at the meeting at all. I told him that I had to leave, that I would go home with my son Mike and his family, and that I would contact him later to talk. I walked up to him to kiss him goodbye, and then said, "Here's a souvenir for you until our next meeting." Paul asked me why I wasn't going home with Joe and Dixie. I just looked at him and replied, "I started having doubts about my friendship with Dixie after I found out that you had an intim with her." Paul's eyes widened. but he didn't deny it. He simply said, "That was several years ago, and it was a mistake. I need you, Dorothy." The word "several years ago" meant that he had slept with Dixie more than once. I didn't say anything in response. I just said goodbye and went to Mike's room. I asked Mike if I could use his phone to call Joe and Dixie and tell them I was going home with him. When Dixie answered the phone, I told her I was going home with my son Mike, but would talk to her in the next few days. She was a little taken aback by my tone, but replied, "Okay, we'll talk later." When I got home, I called George to make arrangements to pick up my personal belongings. I told him that I thought the 65% per 35% asset split was too strict, considering we had saved everything together, but I was willing to accept it so we could move forward. George said I could come over with George Jr. to pick up whatever I needed. If I agreed to the terms of the divorce, I should contact Sally Hawk, his lawyer, and she would handle the paperwork. He added that he now wanted to have as little contact with me as possible and would not be at home when George Jr. and I arrived. I'm a teacher and had to go to work on Monday, so I contacted a realtor to find an apartment without inconveniencing George Jr. as family any longer than necessary. I found an apartment close to the school, just a short drive from my son's houses. I could move in there within a few weeks. I contacted Sally Hawk, and the divorce process began. She turned out to be a very smart lawyer and said that everything would be completed within a few months since neither of us objected to the conditions. I also asked her to contact George and ask if I could buy back some of our furniture, bedding, and other household items for 2/3 of their value to furnish my apartment. Sally must have contacted George because 3 days later he called me personally and asked what it was about. He thought I was going to move to Michigan as soon as the divorce was finalized. I told him that if he agreed to meet me face to face, I would explain everything. "It's too difficult to discuss over the phone," I said. George agreed to come to George Jr.'s house to listen to what I had to say, but reminded me that the divorce was going to happen, and he wanted me to understand that. I assured him that I was fully aware of this and had no intention of setting any traps. I just thought it was time to tell him everything. George Jr. and his family were going to visit his in-laws for a few hours, so we would have some time to talk privately. George arrived, and we sat down in the living room. He on the couch, me in the chair. I offered him a beer, which he, of course, accepted, and I took some iced tea. I asked George not to give me too many shots because I really wanted to tell him everything. He agreed to try to keep it under control, but made no promises. I started by telling him that I would never see Paul again. I had made a huge mistake, and now I'm paying for it. I'm the only one to blame for all of this. For all these years, I thought I loved Paul. Ever since I found out at my first high school reunion that he wanted me, I thought it was love. But all he really wanted was the great night we had. It was the same for me. We were both drawn to illicit relationships, infidelity, and the feeling that we could escape without consequences. We both looked forward to these meetings because they gave us freedom, as if we didn't care about anything but each other. I realized after your speech that I never really knew Paul. I thought I knew him, but all I knew was how good this carefree intim was. No worries, no problems, just so-called love and intimate for 2 or 3 days every few years. We had nothing in common anymore, even though I thought we did. But when I mentioned family, I realized that he wanted nothing to do with it. He simply agreed with everything that was dear to me just to get what he wanted, more of that carefree night. I went into this relationship thinking like a teenager in love. I never matured in my relationship with Paul. It was as if I was wearing blinders, not wanting to discover the truth. If we really loved each other, we would have divorced and gotten married years ago, but that didn't happen. The only reason I believed it was happening now was because Paul got divorced last year. At the meeting, I learned that it was June who filed for the divorce, not Paul. George interrupted me and said, "Why are you telling me all this now? It won't change anything." I continued, "The way I dumped all this on you was wrong, completely wrong. While we may not have had the most loving marriage, you deserved more. Much more. I should have talked to you in person like we're doing now. I know it won't change anything, but I want to go to my grandkids' events and family gatherings. I know you want that too. I want us to at least be polite to each other as a family." I got up and brought George another beer. As I handed it to him, I thought about our marriage. "George, I must apologize for what I said about the children's DNA. God, you didn't deserve this. I don't expect you to ever forgive me for those remarks, but I am truly sorry. Now, looking back, I'm really glad that you are their father. You have always been so kind to them, and they have so many of your good qualities. George looked at me and listened carefully to every word. I could never read his mind, but at least he let me say it all. I have a couple more things I want to say, George. I remember our 33 years together. I can't say there was love, but I can't say it didn't exist either. We've been married. We've had a night. We've had a family. As for our family, there was definitely love between us. Our children knew this, and now they've passed it on to their families. We brought them up well. Maybe we really did have love for each other, but over time, we just didn't try to preserve it as much as we should have. I teared up a little. Maybe if we had shown our feelings to each other the way we showed our children, things would have turned out differently. I know it's too late for us, but after the way you treated me the last month, I started to feel like writing that letter was a mistake. Honestly, I thought I was starting to fall in love with you again. I started crying and said, "Isn't this nonsense?" Then I wiped my tears. George looked at me and said, "At any time before you left for your meeting on Thursday, you could have stopped the letter. Why didn't you do this?" "Well, George," I replied, "deep down I believed I was going to throw it away, but I called Dixie, and she tried to talk me out of it. She suggested that I call Paul and talk to him. If I had been home and had lunch with you as planned, I might have stopped. But as fate would have it, I called Paul and wasn't here when you came home for lunch." George asked, "What about your friends, Dixie and Joe? Have you told them about your latest plans?" "No, George, I didn't talk to them about my future plans. I'm not sure if I even want to remain friends with them. I found out at the meeting that Paul slept with Dixie. He confessed to me, and I believe it happened more than once. If I had known about this sooner, I would have dropped Paul like a hot potato years ago. I find it hard to believe that Dixie would do this if she were a real friend. Joe told people at the meeting that he slept with me 2 weeks ago. I couldn't believe he would lie about me like that. The only problem is that he knew I had a mole. I have no idea how he could have known this unless Dixie told him." "George, did he see us having an intimate at the motel a couple of weeks ago?" "I'm not going to discuss your friends with you, Dorothy. If you need information about them, ask them. These are your friends, not mine. But just so you know, I know men who slept with your friend Dixie. I never told you because I thought you'd probably figure it out yourself. She apparently doesn't know you're still here. She called me on Monday when they returned from the meeting. She wanted to know if she could come over. I simply told her that she was part of the reason my marriage was failing and I had no desire to be friends with her. Then George told me he was selling the house and most of the furniture. The money would be divided according to our agreement. Since I'm staying in the city, I could pick up any furniture I needed for my apartment. He said it would be worth taking Dot's things too, since she would need a place to stay when she wasn't at college. He suggested that she would prefer to live with me so that we could have more time for girl talk. Naturally, he wouldn't take any money from me for the furniture. Before I left, I thanked him for listening to me. Then I looked at him and said, "George, maybe our marriage was more typical of modern marriages. Maybe it wasn't so bad after all. We lasted 33 years and still experienced good moments together." The next day, I called Dixie. She said she was very glad I called her. She was wondering when I was going to move in with Paul. Then she asked what happened after the meeting and at home. I immediately started saying what a vile person she had turned out to be. I'm not moving to Michigan to be with Paul. My whole life with Paul was a farce. I destroyed my marriage, nearly alienated my family, and allowed my so-called best friends to make a complete fool of me. "What are you saying, Dorothy?" Dixie asked. "Dixie, have you ever slept with Paul?" I asked. "Who told you that?" "George?" She asked. "No, irraplia. Actually, Paul said it. Does he have a reason to lie?" "Sorry, Dorothy. It was a long time ago. I didn't mean to upset you." "How long ago was it?" I asked. "Oh God," she replied. "It's been a long time. I don't even remember." "Try to remember, Dixie," I said. "Oh, for God's sake. 10, maybe 15 years ago," she said. "What about 3 years ago when we went to your parents' house and I got sick and went to bed early? I guess you forgot then, but Paul didn't forget." "What about George? Have you ever had a night with him?" I asked. "If George told you he had intimate with me at the motel when we went there, he's lying," Dixie replied. "George didn't tell me anything except that you called him the other day. Did you want to sleep with him again?" I continued. When I asked George what happened at the motel, he simply said, "Ask Dixie." So, If George had an intim with you in a motel, and then you let your husband Joe have a night with me while I was unconscious, then you both deserve to be tried. Dixie replied, it's all George's fault. He started all this. He let Joe sleep with you, and then he slept with me. He knew about your upcoming divorce. I cut her off. You damn society girl. You had a night with my boyfriend, had an intimate with my husband, let that idiot, your husband, take advantage of me, and then George told you that he knew about my letter, and you didn't even say a word to me about all this. I know George well enough to know that he did this all for revenge, but you were my best friend. I never want to see you or your husband again. As for Paul, you can go to his place and have a night with him while your pathetic husband watches. Then I hung up. Our divorce was finalized 6 months ago. My life is pretty sad now. I spent a lot of time in the bar, probably just because I wanted company, someone to talk to. It was then that I began to realize that Dorothy and I had truly lived a life together. Maybe not the best, but not the worst either. But we were life partners. Now I come home to an empty apartment every evening. I sit there and either go online or watch TV. It was okay for the first few months, but now it's getting very boring. Here I am in my 50s, sitting at home alone. I tried dating several women, but they, like me, seemed lonely. With most of them, it came down to night. I guess I was still a womanizer. I didn't want any commitment. I didn't want to get married again, and that's what most of these women seem to want. Someone to share their lives with and who could take care of them. I stayed away from married women. I guess after what happened to me, I didn't want to be responsible for ruining another marriage, even if the woman was just looking for an intimate. I started spending more time at my welding job. The money was good, but money was not my problem. I miss my wife, Dorothy. I don't know how to explain it. This woman had been cheating on me for over 28 years. We lived almost separate lives. She minded her own business, and I minded mine. But there were so many moments when I remembered the times we spent together. Our family vacations. We always had a good time together. We went to our children's games. We were together, laughing and supporting them. The only thing that brought me joy now was meeting my children and grandchild. And then I began to realize that every time I visited them, Dorothy was there. We talked politely, trying not to be rude or bring up the past. Maybe it's just her presence next to me. I don't know. Then I would start thinking again, damn her for what she did to our lives. Then I began to remember all the infidelities that I committed during our marriage. God, I was far from a saint. Most of these women were just casual one-night stands, but they were still cheating. Dorothy probably could have left me after any of them. Why didn't she do this? According to her letter of farewell, she knew about all these betrayals. I can remember at least 20 times when I was unfaithful to her. Why didn't she demand a divorce? Maybe because she thought she was no better than me with her long relationship with that idiot Paul. Damn, I'd like to know that. Maybe someday I'll ask her. I got up from the couch to make myself something to eat. Damn, how I miss Dorothy's cooking. This woman knew how to cook. She knew what I liked and how to prepare it. In fact, she knew everything about my likes and dislikes, right down to what my favorite beer was. I think after 33 years with a person, you learn a lot about them. Why was I so blind to her long relationship? All I knew now was that I would much rather eat one of her pork roasts with baked potatoes and carrots than this frozen pizza I was about to make. I'll have to visit the kids this weekend to get a good dinner. Maybe I'll offer to have a barbecue. They can invite their mother to cook something delicious. I'll offer to bring beer and drinks. That's my thing. The phone rang, and it was my daughter. She said she was coming home for the weekend and just wanted to talk to me and see how I was doing. I simply replied, I'm fine, honey, but I miss your sweet smiling face. She was my little daughter, and I really missed her. She studied in Michigan and tried to come home at least once a month. When she arrived, she stayed with her mother. They talked a lot and did their feminine things, whatever that meant. After a few minutes of talking, I suggested that she call her brother Gar and tell him she was coming over for the weekend and that we could have a barbecue. She could even invite her mother. Dad, she replied, you miss Mom's cooking, don't you? No, I said. She interrupted me. It's okay, Dad. I miss Mom's cooking too. I'll tell her about the barbecue. I'm sure she'll come. What do you want her to cook? She laughed. Why are you so sure that she will come? I asked. Dad, I shouldn't tell you this, but Mom said that every time you plan to come, we must definitely invite her. I know you don't want to hear this, Dad, but I really believe that Mommy loves you. She lives in a hell that she created for herself. She completely blames herself for everything she did to you. I don't think she'll ever get over this. This actually worries me a little. Her life is school and family. I know she's not dating anyone. Many men have asked her out on a date, but she simply replies, "No, thank you." Mom also stopped communicating with her best friend, Dixie. She hasn't told me the whole story, but I know it has something to do with her old boyfriend. And you, Dad, would you like to enlighten me? She laughed. Anyway, Dad, what do you want Mom to cook? How about some pork roast? I started to speak, but Dad interrupted me again. Dad, this is a barbecue. No barbecue pork roast. Okay, I said. How about Mom's chicken wings with her signature sauce and potato casserole? I'll buy the chicken. Gar will grill it, and Mom will make the sauce and casserole. Dot laughed. Okay, Dad. I'll see what I can do. She paused for a moment and then added, Daddy, I love you. I love you too, honey, I replied. See you on Sunday. I then hung up. The frozen pizza was ready. It was time for dinner. When I started eating the pizza, a feeling of loneliness overtook me. About half an hour later, the phone rang again. I looked at the caller ID, and it was Gar. Hey, Dad, it's Gar. How are you? He asked. Yes, I'm finishing dinner and watching TV. What's new? I asked. We're having a barbecue at noon on Sunday, and I was wondering if you'd like to join. What will you have? I asked. Barbecue chicken and potato casserole, he said, as if I didn't know. He laughed. My children were smart. It's probably Dorothy, I said. I'll be there at noon. I replied. Dad, you buy beer and drinks, and we'll take care of the chicken. Buy more chips and sauce, he said. I will, I replied, adding, thanks, Junior. Anytime, Daddy replied, then hung up. God, even my children knew how I felt, how I loved them. Sunday came, and I headed to Gar's house. I remembered to buy beer, drinks, chips, and dip as requested. When I entered, everyone greeted me. I hugged them all, kissed my grandchildren, and my 2 daughters-in-law. That came up to me, kissed me on the cheek, and whispered, Don't worry, Daddy. She's here. I just looked at Dot, wondering how she knew what I was thinking. Then I looked up and saw Dorothy, dressed in a beautiful yellow summer dress, applying her special barbecue sauce to the chicken. I walked up to Dorothy and said, Hi, Dorothy. Nice to see you again. The chicken smells great. Dorothy smiled at me and said, Thank you, George. I prepared it the way you like it. How are you doing at school? She asked, trying to start a casual conversation. The kids get on my nerves sometimes, but otherwise everything is fine. She then said she needed to go check on the potato casserole in the oven. My other son, Mike, came up to me and said he wanted to talk privately. We went into the living room away from everyone, and he said that it had spoken to him earlier and that Dorothy's former friends, Dixie and Joe, had split up. Now Joe started calling Dorothy and pestering her. Dad, I can't let that idiot bother Mom, Mike said. I don't know what it is exactly, but it said he wants to humiliate her. I can't let this happen. Mom has already suffered enough. Damn, I loved how my kids defended their mother. There's no way I'm letting them get involved in this problem. I looked at Mike and told him, stay away. Don't do anything stupid. You have a family to take care of. I'll handle this problem with Joe myself. We went back outside and joined the barbecue. I thanked Gar for the invitation, saying it was the best barbecue chicken I'd had in a long time. Thank Mom, he replied. She cooked it along with the potatoes. I just looked at Dorothy and said, Thank you, Dorothy. You've always been a great cook. She just looked at me and replied, Thanks, George. Anytime. I wonder what she meant by anytime. Was it just a casual phrase, or did she really mean it? I returned home and began to think about what to do with Joe. Now he was interfering with my family. This shouldn't have happened. I waited until Monday and went to a bar where I knew Joe might be. I saw him on a bar stool and walked up to him. When he saw me, he was clearly nervous. Joe, I need to talk to you now, I said. I was a welder with strong hands and a solid grip. Joe, on the other hand, worked in an office and didn't even play sports. Joe looked at me and said, I have nothing to tell you, George. Joe, I said, I want to talk to you. I suggest you get off this damn bar stool and come over here to the booth to talk for a minute, or I'll go outside and wait for you there. The choice is yours. Joe climbed out of his chair and sat in the booth across from me. I stared into his eyes, saying nothing for a few seconds to make him start to get nervous. Then I said, "What the hell did I hear about you calling Dorothy?" He looked at me and said, "What do you care? You're divorced. She can date anyone. She's an adult, over 21 years old." I stared at him again, waiting for a pause before speaking, making him even more nervous. Then, in a very low voice, so only he could hear, I said, "Listen, man, I made a mistake by letting you take advantage of the situation with her as revenge. I shouldn't have done this. You are not worthy to wipe your feet on her. You call her again, you'll apologize for any of your words and say that you will never, and I emphasize never, bother her again. If I find out that you called her again or badmouthed her in any way, I will personally find you and put you in a damn plastic bag. Have you made yourself clear?" He muttered, "Yes, I understand." I looked at him again and said, "I didn't hear you." He answered louder, "Yes, I understand, and I promise not to bother her again." "One more thing, idiot," I added. "Call your friend Paul and give him the same message. This is not a threat, it is a fact. Next time I come here, there will be no talking. Do I have to break your arm or smash your face for you to understand clearly?" "No, Dort. I understand, and I will pass on this message to Paul," he said. "You will call Dorothy as soon as possible. I don't want you to piss her off again." After these words, I got up and left the bar. Thursday came, and I was at work. One of my employees and I were doing welding work when the explosion occurred. I woke up in a hospital room. One of my sisters-in-law, Lisa, was sitting next to me, looking at me. She screamed, He woke up, and hugged me tightly. I asked her, "What happened?" She said, "There was an explosion on Thursday, and you've been unconscious since." "What day is it today?" "Today is Sunday," Lisa answered. "You've been in a coma since Thursday. We all took turns on duty near you, replacing each other every 4 hours. Everyone except Dorothy." I felt sad when she said that Dorothy wasn't on duty with me. I don't know why, but I thought at that moment, Dorothy entered the room with tears in her eyes. Lisa continued, "Except Dorothy. She didn't leave. She stayed here with you, sleeping in the chair. We forced her to go home to clean herself up, but she returned an hour later. She even took the day off from school to spend time here with you on Friday. All this time, Dorothy stood at the door and cried. I didn't know what to think. Then, she walked over to the bed, hugged me, and said, 'Welcome back, George. We all missed you.' When she left, my whole family came into the room, hugged me, kissed me, and burst into tears. All this emotion overwhelmed me, and I started to tear up. Then Dot came over, hugged me, kissed me, and said, 'We all missed you, Daddy, and we love you.' From the way she said it, I knew she included Dorothy in her words. Then the doctor entered the room and asked everyone to leave. When my family left, Dorothy said, 'I'm not leaving. He is my husband, and I will stay with him.' The doctor was surprised but replied, 'Okay, just sit down, please.' Dorothy sat down in a chair. The doctor examined me and asked many questions. I told him that the last thing I remembered was the explosion and then waking up just a few minutes ago. The doctor made notes in my chart and said that I might be discharged the next day if all the tests were normal. The only thing he emphasized was that I should not be alone. 'You need someone to be there for at least the next few days,' he added. 'You need to rest more and not move too much.' The doctor said I had a concussion, but in his opinion, there was no internal bleeding. He noted that I was very lucky. God had given me a second chance at life because the explosion could have killed me. He said he would come back in the morning to check on me again and left the room. My family returned to the room, and Dorothy explained to them everything the doctor had said. They immediately began to worry about who would look after me after I was discharged because I couldn't be left alone. Dorothy looked at me, then at the children, and said, 'I'm taking Daddy home with me for a few days until he gets better. He needs someone to look after him.' I called the school and took a week of personal leave. I explained the accident situation, and they gave me time off without any problem. I looked at Dorothy and said, 'Wait a minute, don't I have a say in this matter?' My whole family looked at me and said in unison, 'No.' All I could answer was, 'Okay.' Dorothy went out to talk to the nurse, and I asked her about my business and how Ben, my assistant at work, was doing. He said that Ben was fine. He was far from the explosion. It was Ben who called 911. When Mom found out you were in the hospital, she immediately contacted your office and made arrangements for the weekend. She told Ben to call her on Monday to make sure everyone had work. She just took control, Daddy said. She said that in 33 years with you, she had learned enough about business to organize everything. I know, Dad, Mom hurt you a lot, but she's still an amazing woman and a wonderful mom. I can't tell you what to do, but we all know that Mommy still loves you. We see it, but we will respect any decision you make. As my family was leaving, the nurses came into the room and gave me medicine. I had a severe headache and soon fell asleep. I woke up late at night and saw Dorothy still sitting in the chair, looking at me. When she saw me open my eyes, she asked, "George, are you okay?" I asked her, "Why didn't you go home with the others?" She simply replied, "Tomorrow we will go home together, George." I nodded and went back to sleep. The next morning, Jor and Mike came over to help me pack up the clothes, flowers, and cards I had received while in the hospital, while Dorothy worked on my discharge paperwork. She received all the instructions from the doctor about what to do in the next few days. My sons helped me get to Dorothy's apartment. I realized that I had never been there before. There was a lot of our old furniture inside. My favorite chair and sofa were also there. My son sat me down in a chair and lifted my legs, saying they would come by later. Dorothy came into the room and asked if I wanted something to eat. I said I wouldn't mind a sandwich and a cup of coffee. She went into the kitchen while I rested. A few minutes later, she brought me a ham and cheese sandwich prepared the way I liked it, with Swiss cheese, tomato, and ham on toasted rye bread. She remembered my favorite sandwich. She also brought a cup of hot coffee, which was just perfect. She placed a tray of food in front of me, turned on the TV to my favorite sports channel, and left the room. Damn, how I missed her. I really missed her. Just having her in the house made everything better. What the hell am I supposed to do now? I honestly didn't know. After I ate, I apparently dozed off. I remember how I began to dream, or perhaps just reflect, on our last conversation. I remember Dorothy saying, "I think about our 33 years all the time. I can't say that there was love there, but I also can't say that there wasn't. We had a marriage, we had a family, and in terms of our family, we both definitely love the children. They knew it, and now they themselves pass it on to their families. We did a good job raising them. Maybe we really had love for each other, but over all these long years, we just didn't work on it the way we should have. Maybe if we'd shown our feelings to each other the same way we showed our children, things might have turned out differently. I know it's too late for us, but after the way you treated me for the last month, I started to feel like writing that letter was a mistake. I truly began to believe that I was falling in love with you again." She started crying and said, "Well, isn't that ironic?" Then she wiped away her tears. Then I remembered the doctor's words. "You had a concussion, but as far as I know, there is no internal bleeding. You are incredibly lucky. God gave you a second chance at life. You could have easily died when you were thrown back by the blast wave." I woke up and saw that Dorothy had taken the tray and cup and was now sitting again, looking at me. "George, are you okay?" she asked. "George, I want to thank you for what you did for me." "What have I done?" I asked. "Joe called and apologized for bothering me. I know you talked to him. I don't know who told you this, but it was a huge relief for me. He said he would never bother me again. And that's not all, George. Paul also called me and said almost the same thing. I don't know how you did it, but I just want to tell you thank you. George, while we're apologizing, I have an apology for you." "Dorothy," I said, "when I was in revenge mode, I let Joe take advantage of you. Now looking back, I understand that it was mean, even for me. If I could take it back, I would change everything. I know Dixie told you about it. It was something I should never have done. I think you've shaken my cage too much," I added. "Dorothy, we need to talk more, but right now, I'd like to get some rest. George, I got Dot's room ready for you. She was very happy that you would stay here and offered her room. As you know, she had to go back to college today, but she said she'll be in touch and might come home next weekend to visit you." Dorothy helped me get out of my chair and walk to Dot's room. She brought me my medications, and I went back to sleep. For the next couple of days, I was heavily medicated and spent most of my time in a chair or in bed. Every time I woke up, I knew Dorothy was there. She turned out to be an excellent nurse. My sons visited me to check how I was doing. I told them I was getting better. The next day, we had to go to the doctor to see how my recovery was going. Dorothy took care of my business and made sure the work continued. This woman did everything for me. Why had I never noticed this before? It seems that for some people, you have to go through a divorce and almost die to realize everything. The next day, we went to the doctor, and he said everything looked fine. In his opinion, I would be able to return to work next Monday. Dorothy was very happy and said it was great news, but she knew it was time for me to return to my own home. She took me home and came in with me. The house seemed gloomy and dark compared to her apartment. It was probably just the influence of a woman's touch. The brightest thing in my house at that moment was Dorothy herself, standing in front of me. I looked at her and wondered at what point and where everything went wrong. I asked her if I could come see her the next day to talk. She looked at me and said, "Anytime, George. It will be fine. Do you want me to cook dinner? I can prepare something for you when you come." I looked at her and said, "That would be very nice of you." She smiled and said, "Roast pork, baked potatoes, and carrots." I just smiled. She knew my favorite dish. The next day, I went to her house for dinner. She prepared my favorite dish. After that, we talked for a long time. I told her that I would like to start dating her again, but we need to take it slow. We both lived in different houses. I started visiting her at least 5 times a week. I think we started to fall in love with each other again. We no longer took each other for granted and tried not to dwell on the past. We didn't talk about remarriage, but to all our friends, we were a couple again. Our children and grandchildren were always happy to see us together. Returning to my apartment didn't seem so hard anymore because I knew that tomorrow I would see Dorothy again. The first time we made love again, I thought it would be awkward, but it wasn't. We reconnected as a couple and put each other first. We literally made love. I didn't go to bars anymore. I didn't need to. I had a loving partner whom I could turn to at any time. And this began to happen more and more often. Will we get married again? We don't know. Right now, we just meet and enjoy every day. As the doctor said, God gave me a second chance at life. It was the least I could do for Dorothy. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you. And stay tuned for the next story. Trust me, this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about it. Click to the next one, click to the next one, click to the next one, click to the next one.